All right. I think it's time to get this started. So, hello, everyone. I'm going to be your moderator today. My name is Aaron Rosenthal. This session is the topic of the session is Better Together in 2023 Data and RevOps. I am joined by Molly Bodensteiner, who leads global revenue operations at Deal.
them is going to use to edit and then deliver to a customer off of data that resides in Marketo for someone who hasn't touched Marketo or been active in the marketing frame for more than 18 months, because that data is obviously going to have staled out and you may be referring to the wrong experience or anything. So understanding the data landscape and the governance framework of where accuracy resides within the lifecycle of data is going to become hypercritical when we start plugging in machine learning into the whole content curation process.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the data, yeah, to your point, the data lifecycle, right, is huge. And understanding that and being able to, and this is where I think CRMs fail us quite a bit, is, the recency and the relevance of the data.
Right.
There is not a good way to understand that within CRM.
Absolutely.
Well, there's recency, there's relevance, there's also how comprehensive is the data, right? Because
right.
I've one of the things that we see all the time at Syncari, and one of the big reason why companies work with us is you may have data across systems, but the question is, which system is the master? Which system is going to, is that definitive truth on, this is the customer, these are the interactions that they have. If you're a retail business, you have interactions that, may happen in a store, may happen online, may happen in your mobile app. And a lot of times, companies are still trying to check that, check things off the list. Yes, we've got our product data, or yes, we've got our app data, or yes, we've got, our website engagement data. For you, Paul, because you're on the marketing side, I'm sure a lot of what you're trying to do with data, part of it is both awareness around insights, how things are performing, where are opportunities to make improvements, but also machine learning for marketing is huge because it can add that next activation layer, right, for your customers. But having that holistic, awareness of everywhere that customers may engage with you is essential to making sure that anything that you're going to be training a, ML model on to, for example, like you said, write a script. You don't want to have those blind spots. So how confident are you, Paul, that, or how are you tackling what may be already or still blind spots, and how you're weaving those into what you're trying to create, which I would imagine is this cohesive story around everything that a customer does and how they interact with your company?
Yeah, I mean, I think a subtitle for this portion of the conversation is going to be everything everywhere all at once. I mean, if you really have to, if we want to peel the onion of machine learning and data, particularly in the marketing world, I work at OneTrust. So the idea of consent and preference management extends to the notion that we need to be geographically sensitive to any norms or legislation related to how data is handled. And with the proliferation of machine learning, the next capability that we are designing into our marketing data infrastructure is consenting data use for machine learning, because there are jurisdictions that will very quickly establish legislative requirements that say, even as fundamental as scoring, you need consent to score someone's behavior. And the capability to manage where the consent is to leverage data for machine learning is going to become a significant component or element of the way that the data infrastructure needs to be established. So data discovery as a discipline is something very foreign at the moment in the marketing and sales universe, but the moment that consent relates to what machine learning activities can be processed on an individual's data, the notion of data discovery to understand what systems store what relevant PII related to an individual, so that if an individual says they do not want any of their data involved in any machine learning algorithms that are being used, we need to be able to silence and control the proliferation of that data in the ecosystem, because we aren't consented to store or process that individual's data. So It's
And
a
ideally,
Pandora's box. And that's where I'm saying that I don't know how far you want to go into this conversation because it's probably 4 webinars worth. But the idea of what data we have, the way it's being leveraged, and what systems and tools are proliferating that data internally becomes extremely significant when we talk about consented data.
I'd imagine you want, and maybe you already have, that one place where you can manage that consent, even though it's potentially half a dozen different systems that are either creating or sharing that data.
And there's one system that I could recommend, and it's OneDress. But this is not a commercial, so
it helps that you have that, though. I mean,
that's right.
And how about you, Molly? When it comes to making sure that I know that you're being on the RevOps side, I'm sure heavily focused on insights from the data. I'm sure automations are certainly part of that. But when it comes to ensuring that, when you're making business decisions off of data that you're collecting across many different systems, how confident are you, and what do you do to make sure that that data is as holistic as it can be?
Yeah, and I think, generally I think about it as kind of 2 different sets of data. Like there's the just-in-time components, which is the one-to-one, right? So when I think about what am I surfacing up to a sales rep, to a CSM, to an SDR, to marketing for next best action. So how am I taking and understanding the experience and then driving what should that next touch be based on the individualized data that I have at an account, contact, lead component, and making sure, I think about this from the experience is like, should I send that email promoting this product if they have a tier 1 support ticket open? Probably not, right? Very, very simple usage of behavioral data and situational data. And then we look at what I consider the aggregation data. And that's what's pulling into like the BI tool, understanding trends, the combination of data to say, where do we have gaps in potentially our upsell process? What are we seeing there? How do we structure that? And pulling that in place. So there's a level of, confidence. And one of the things that I think tends to hinder people the most is they sit down and they say, we want this report, we want this dashboard, we want this thing, and we want all of this, right? And generally, like the approach that I take is like, pick the 5 things that you need to have done right. And one of the first questions I've started asking is like, how do you define a customer? Let's start and make sure we're aligned on definitions of data and like what these things mean. Because if marketing is defining a customer as something different than sales, then different than product, then different than CSMs, you've got a whole other situation in front of you. So start with the definitions, make sure aligned on core definitions that you're going to use across all your analytics, and then start layering in your metrics and dimensions and continuing to align on that. But I think a lot of people spend so much time creating the dashboard, creating the report, creating the information that they don't actually think about using it and don't actually start using it. How valuable is a Looker dashboard to a sales rep? Generally not super valuable versus putting something within a platform that they can action off of and start changing behavior.
Yeah, I mean, that's having data that you can do something with versus just, seeing the data is one thing. Actually understanding what that data should inform is, I think that's really that divide between RevOps and even data teams. It's, RevOps, their responsibility is to interpret the data. Data teams are to deliver it. When it comes to, you kind of touched on, one example of next best action or like scoring. But when it comes to, I'd like to talk through like one example that, let's say like a KPI or key. I don't know if either of you operate with, some North Star metric. But when it comes to measuring success of, either of you can give an example, and I'll start with you, Paul, around a KPI that, has been operationalized within your organization. But to get to that point, there are simple KPIs like how many people are converting on my website. I'd even call that more of a metric. But there's KPIs that are, that aggregate of, one example might be a customer health score, which is an aggregate of metrics that have to come from many different places. To have that holistic awareness of customer health, it's how are they engaging on your website? What are they doing in your product? Have they contacted support? What's their overall experience? It's many different points. Lots of different systems are collecting that information. And so, Paul, you can give another example, or I don't know if you're doing customer health scores, but I'd love to hear how you have tackled, a new KPI where you had to work with your data teams to, get these blind areas into this KPI.
Yeah, that's a fun and interesting one. I think the best example that I would point to is way back in the days at Marketo when we were working to establish a a full journey score path that said, there's marketing engagement. We wanted to score and rate marketing engagement, which obviously marketing teams have done for a very long time. But we wanted to extend that similar model to sales engagement, support engagement, knowledge engagement, and have all four of those pillars be informative of a renewal propensity type model that says, well, customer was extremely excited in the marketing cycle. They were pretty actively engaged in the sales cycle. The implementation was done. We saw 120 days of activity within the product. But since then, we went from 9 active users to 2 active users, and those users have become less and less active. The content that they're navigating on the support portal is all very low complexity content. So they're obviously not using the higher ends of the product. So when the CSM is trying to convince their management that the customer's absolutely going to renew, the indicators are all there to show no, it's likely not going to happen. And I think, though, if I take the framework of the notion of having KPIs and complex KPIs, as this one was for a renewal, the challenge I see today, particularly in our, the journey we've all been on for the last 3 years, is how to effectively craft relevant KPIs, because the rule books can periodically get thrown out. The behaviors of prospects, customers, and employees can have unexpected consequences on what seemed to be a stable model in the past. So I think that it's a matter of ensuring that there is enough operational flexibility in the definitions of a framework for establishing a KPI to be able to respond when the data patterns don't support the assumptions that you're looking for. I think too quickly people leap to conclusions because they're seeing data and they don't think too much about whether or not the data model and the technologies surfacing this data might be surfacing irrelevant data. One of the questions that was asked in the chat here was, what's the best period, or what's an optimal period of time to consider the effectiveness of a marketing campaign? Time is one dimension, but also the volume of responses is another. But then there are all sorts of other variables that are so important to consider when you're trying to determine whether or not a campaign is effective. Did you target it at the right audience? It could be that it was an absolutely great campaign with really relevant messaging that you just happened to aim at the wrong people. And so you might throw the campaign out the door, but that wasn't the statistical issue that was really relevant. Anyway, I can wander along on this topic for quite a while, as you can tell. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's no small thing to align an organization around a KPI, let alone figure out how to get to that KPI. But you mentioned it being nimble, because I've never worked at a company that made any assumptions that were either made false or had to be changed. And so, getting to point A is step one, right? It's optimizing, refining, and making sure that you don't just live with that KPI for the rest of your life. You need to understand, what parts of it are working, and then of course how it's, is it informing the right actions that are going to make a real difference?
Yep.
You've got to have a baseline to work off of and challenge against, right? And you can't improve what you don't track and what you don't measure. So you've got to start somewhere, but not have the rigidness to not adapt and not to, continue to question. as well, especially as your business changes and evolves. What you looked at 100 million is going to be very different than what you're going to look at or 1 million versus 100 million.
Right.
Exactly. Molly, similar question, but I'm curious, is there something that you're trying to do? Like, is there a metric or a key KPI that, you folks feel that, okay, we should be looking at this, and how you're going about trying to accomplish that? I'm assuming like no one has done everything that they want to do. So there's got to be some stuff, that you're trying to tackle.
Yeah, I think there's, several things that we'll continue to try to tackle, especially as our product evolves. And I know, there were some PLG conversations in the chat, but really as we think about, how we continue to fold in product usage information as an indicator and start to build out metrics based on, and to Paul's point, what are they doing? What is happening in the product, or what's not happening and the product, and how should we understand how that should drive our right interactions and our next best actions, whether that's through automation or through human engagement, and start to prioritize tier and action off of those are always things that will continue to shape as we define the right customer experience. And again, I think it's there's a lot of really I always think about there's a lot of really cool things you can do, but there's really a few things that you should do. Right. And so really finding that balance and going back to what is the experience that our customers expect, and making sure that we're meeting them where they want to be met.
Yeah, I love the PLG stories, and whether you are whether you've fully embraced a PLG motion, you might be a direct sales org. If you have software, you better be doing something with how, with the data around how users are engaging with that software, because there's a whole treasure trove of insights that could be extracted from that. For you, Molly, when you mentioned, there are some KPIs that you're trying to tackle, but how are you working with your data team? Like, are they giving you a place to access that data, or do you have a process in place where when you need product data, you know where to go to get it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure they're not super thrilled that they give me access to it, right? But if you're in RevOps and you don't know how to write SQL, highly recommend you start arming yourself with W3 School and be able to self-service on a read-only level. It's not that I'm going in and they're not letting me build pipelines, maybe someday, but probably not. But being able to self-service, validating the data that I need and understanding the construct. So as they've done a phenomenal job of building, the right data dictionary, the right data documentation, understanding, the DBT setup that I need to go in, so I can self-service, right? And I think that was a very smart thing of the data team, that they don't want to be the blocker of educating and building knowledge across stakeholders to be able to self-service. So being able to go into Snowflake, run my own queries, and Looker, run my own queries and see what I need to see and make the small adjustments that I need to. If they were a 2,000 person company, if every single person had to ask them to say, add another dimension into this or adjust this, that's all they do all day. So they've done a nice job at building in self-service components to be able to access the data and validate the data, which I think is huge. Same thing like any RevOps people on here. Same thing you want to do. You don't want to spend all day building Salesforce reports. Teach your stakeholders how to fish. Help them understand, put the right documentation in place so that they can self-learn, self-engage, self-action.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we see a lot at Syncari. I mean, that's a big part of what we do, which is a central unified data repository that no code experts can access. But I know that there are people who are very proficient with SQL. That there's plenty of things that you can do faster with more flexibility with SQL. I do think that, and I'm curious, maybe in either of your experiences, how often you find yourself working with, or with peers that are SQL experts, that are on the operations side. In my experience, it's fairly rare, but it is becoming a skill set that more and more people realizing that they need to learn and adopt. But when you don't have that skill set, do you like Paul? Do you find yourself reliant heavily on data teams each time you need new data to give you access to it, or do you have? Molly sounds like she's in a good spot. She can jump into Snowflake. She can do some of her own stuff. I think a lot of folks who especially don't have data teams, don't necessarily have that access. Would you say you're in that boat, Paul, or are you lucky like Molly? I know you've got Snowflake, but
Yeah, so I think the discussion is really around the democratization of data skills and then the availability of access and understanding of what the data is. So, obviously Molly has a very robust set of skills and a very strong maturity, experience of maturity that leads to a high degree of competency to look at the data, know where to look, and understand what the data shows. In our organization, as I said, the repositories are really just being established. I have to be careful here. I'm pretty sure there's no one from OneTrust on this call, but if it's being recorded, I don't want to say things that'll come back and get me in trouble. But the relevance of the data, regardless of the skills to access it, the ease of consumption of the data dictionary to know what data is sitting in what table and whatnot. The critical dimension in OneTrust's instance is it's data from 5 different brands that all had different definitions of customer lifecycle, that had different ways of tracking information, that has been consolidated into a single repository. So if you're looking for, as a simple thing, the lead statuses, and you want to see the historical status that an individual record has traveled through, one of our brands, Conversant, didn't use the leads object at all. And the contact object was where everything resided, and their definition of life cycle stages was very different than the definitions we're using today. So when we brought the data over, we aligned the pick list values so that it all made sense today. If you're looking at that data and you don't understand the history and the legacy of the data that you're looking at, you may make a set of very bad assumptions when you pull your query and start analyzing the results. So I think that, as Molly was talking about it, it's not only the technical skills of pulling the information and getting it into a place where you can analyze it. It's understanding what's the legacy of the data that's there. What is the transformation? What's the transformative journey that the data itself has taken in our circumstance? And Molly alluded to acquisitions and new data coming in. So you have that to look forward to, is how do you normalize from different places? But again, it's complicated.
Well, and it's just even, if you look at something like, revenue as an example, right? And you start looking at, ASP by product over time, and you have a price increase 12 months ago and you see this peak, like you have, you have to understand like the narration behind what the data is saying. You might look at that and be like, man, we just started crushing it.
Yeah,
and like that's
whatever
what
those
happened.
campaigns were that we were doing at that same time, let's do more of those campaigns. Well, there was a pretty false assumption.
Yeah, and so like you have to understand the situational components that go into the data behind it too, and that is something that like doesn't come from running the SQL query, right? That doesn't come from the piece, and like you have to have the business context around that. And like one of the things that I think businesses, quite frankly, I'm going to say suck, but that's the word you're going to get today, is documenting that. So when you do your annual planning and you are building your models and you are starting to look at historicals, like putting the right footnotes into that, so you have that legacy and you have that historical context behind things, so you know why you're making the decisions you're making and why you made these decisions based off data. The other piece that I was going to add on this is, right, like I can write, I can't, but like I could write the best SQL, so cool all day, starting pulling things together. But if I don't understand like the foundational structure of how the integration and the table was constructed and the sources behind it, I'm not going to get as far as I need to, because again, I might be making data decisions off of assumption and building things off of assumption, right? So I think that still goes back to the whole point on documentation and making sure you really have clear clear alignment on your documentation and what's going into it. It's the junk in, junk out.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with what you're building there.
Yeah, I mean, you both explained like things that we do as as yourselves as operations professionals in giving yourselves more context, and I'm going to kind of take the data quality angle, but like understanding where the data came from, how old it is, the lineage of that data. That's the things that we can do in ensuring that that awareness around those items can inform, okay, you can make some changes to like, all right, maybe I don't want data that's that old, or maybe I don't need data from this system. But when it comes to your data teams, around the topic of like data quality, what is it that you are hoping your data team is doing to ensure that once the data gets to you, you have that confidence and trust that that data has gone through all the steps to the point where and have that confidence and trust that it's it is what it is trying to represent.
I mean, it goes back to chicken and egg, right? It goes back to the documentation. I want to be able to know that they've documented what they've put in place, and like we've reviewed that. One of the things that we do is when we are standing up a new data product, it's before they build anything, right? We have the alignment, we have that this is the KPI, this is the source of the data that's going into it. These are the tables that we're going to use from Salesforce or HubSpot or whatever piece, and this is the attribute, right? And really spending the time to document that. The other thing that I, really harp on is like the scalability of the infrastructure that we build, and like the less we can hard code, the better within our SQL and within that, because that just makes my life horrible anytime I add a new pick list value and they have to go and like make an adjustment to the SQL. So like being really mindful of, what is the scalability of the data product that you're trying to build. And, you're building something for today, but how do you not have to recreate it for tomorrow when your business evolves too?
Seems like one assumption that we can always, all make and all the time is things are going to change.
Oh yeah.
Whatever.
And the more you can have the source of the data be actually the source in the SQL versus the manipulation, the better.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. So a few things, yeah, we've discussed a lot of things that you folks are working with data teams on. I'm curious, I'd love to hear an example of, where have been some like significant challenges in engaging your data teams, beyond prioritization, because we kind of touched on that. That's always going to be a challenge, but aligning around, whether it's delivering data or, data quality. Paul, we'll start with you. Just an example of like, what would you love to get, what would you love to see change in how you engage with your data teams? And I mean, there's always this one part, everyone wants more access to their data. So that's probably a given, but more specifically, what is it that you wish you had, like wish you could get out of your data team, or wish that you were able to collaborate more effectively with your data team on?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you take away my ability to rely on the best answers, but and again, I'm going to be a little bit mindful of the way that I phrase this, because it's not intended to be critical. I think that, as in many parts of an operations-based business, and that's the business that we're in RevOps, the understanding of business context is a skill that, luckily in my experience, I've partnered with some very robust data operations teams that have data architects who understand the business operations and the business itself. So their lens on data isn't pure digital. Their understanding and their lens on data is contextual for business. But I would suggest, in my prior experience as a solution architect, the ability to understand and have contextual knowledge around raw data is a skill that many data operations teams lack. And it is the art of what that business and function needs, where having the fundamental appreciation, understanding of the data architecture, where data resides, what its sources are, having that robust engineering lens is 70% of what that team should be skilled at. But the remaining 30%, if we call that the art of context and understanding the importance, what Molly was talking about in terms of documentation, that's the equivalent that I find is often missing in those teams because it's very hard to hire for. It's generally knowledge that only comes through operational wisdom of time, where you've seen the data evolve, so you understand what that data's journey has been. But I would say I would highlight that as being an area of operational challenge that that I've encountered many times.
Yeah, the first thing I thought when Aaron asked, what do I wish that our team, I was like, I really just want to say I wish they knew Salesforce, right? But I know that that's not, there's a fine balance in that, right? Of, sometimes it's good to not know, so you're not making the assumptions, right? And it's important to ask, but then on the flip side, it's, it's less about knowing Salesforce. Sorry, that was probably a bad way to say it, but understanding like the business context behind this and the processes, right? Because there's such a byproduct and like such a downstream output of this that, like, by not understanding, the top level, there's likely things we're missing, and some of that context would come in to help to challenge in some situations. So it's kind of, ignorance is bliss, but then there's also, pros of knowing it, because I think you still then can help contribute at a different level.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're both echoing the difference between, really working with your data teams as true collaborators, because they understand the context of how that data is going to be used. They understand what decisions it's going to be informed, versus people who are responsible for just giving you numbers or just giving you data.
Right.
Because there's always something that, we all have our blinders on. We all have our own objectives and are, super focused on one thing. And to have someone who knows how that data is going to be used and what decisions it might be driving is going to also help them, inform themselves. Like maybe there's a different way to go about this. Maybe there are some, blind spots that I'm not being asked to uncover, but probably should.
Yeah, no, and Molly, I think the reference to Salesforce, the moment you said that, I had a little PTSD related to some of the challenges back from when Marketo was acquired by Adobe. And I had the opportunity to wander around Adobe's instance of Salesforce. And let me just tell you, I think Adobe needs a gold star for having the most hairy, messy instance of Salesforce that I think exists. And they're in the middle of a migration to Dynamics that's almost 3.5 years old right now. But I did not know. I mean, I think we've all encountered the fact that you get a maximum number of custom fields that you can build on standard objects in Salesforce, and the number is 800. Well, Adobe has maxed out the custom field count on leads, accounts, contacts, opportunity, campaign members. So, I mean, right there, that's impressive.
So the solution is just to build some custom objects to have more custom fields.
So Adobe followed that path. There are 1,800 custom objects in Adobe's Salesforce instance. So if you have a data team that doesn't understand the operational limitations of a system like Salesforce, they may make assumptions about the data that they're pulling from that system without respecting or understanding the operational limitations that system itself puts on the data.
Yeah.
So
I just still, and this is every data team I've ever worked with, not a deal, leads versus contacts, right? like the concept of how a lead converts to a contact in an account, like if you have not lived and breathed that in like a CRM instance, you will not understand it in like a data infrastructure. And I can't tell you how many times I've like recorded a Zoom of like, this is a lead, this is a contact, this is what the difference is, here's how they work. And that goes back to like the process, right? And how the technology supports the process.
Right.
So we're almost towards the end. We've got about 7 minutes left, and I wanted to shift gears just a little bit and touch on, things to like, what happens when I don't have a data team? I think there's probably folks on this call that, you're both lucky where you've got, resources, you've got other people who are responsible for these, certain silos of responsibilities and data. But when you don't have a data team, what might be some things, what are some table stakes that a, non-data engineer or data scientist can do? If you're in RevOps or marketing ops, we'll start with you, Molly. Like, what would be a good starting point to become a little bit more data proficient, to get more mature around how you leverage your data, yet you don't have a data team. So you're kind of bound by the tools, probably more the like user tools that you're using today, like your Salesforce or your HubSpot.
Yeah, and you don't have to be like a data engineer to use that data, right? You have kind of the native reporting functionality within CRM, within your HubSpot, within your marketing automation, within your platform that you can join. And so when you get to the point that you probably exhaust that sophistication, it's, how do you stand up a data lake out of warehouse, right, at a light level to start to integrate that data together? There's a lot of, if you're using, I'm going to say the words, like if you're using standard tools, right? This is probably a whole different conversation if you've got a bunch of homegrown pieces or, tools that don't necessarily have strong APIs to them. It's really easy to start to feed data together. Obviously, your volume of data is going to come into play, as well as, the security around your data. I wouldn't be like, hey, go drop everything you own in a Google Sheet, right? But building the right, infrastructure to be able to start doing some light data analytics. There's, Google's visualization tool. What is it? It's
Looker.
It's not Looker. It's conjoined to BigQuery, very front end, very easy to use. To just start doing some like beginning visualization pieces. There's like, poor man's data analytics. Start there. Like look at this in the way that you don't have to sit down and say like, I need to be a proficient data scientist, data engineer. Like look at citizen development. Figure out the things that you can use to bring things together to get you the information you need. At the end of the day, like what you're probably trying to do is join different pieces of data to tell the story. So define what that story is and what that narrative is that you're trying to get to, and work backwards from that. If you go into this and saying like, I just need to bring everything in place, like you're going to sit and drown.
Yeah. And how about for you, Paul, like, especially since you've also, you're on the marketing side. And so there's activation, the whole activation orchestration side that you deal with. Beyond the tools that you use, because you can you can log into your tool and you can get analytics with the blinders on specific to what that tool is doing.
Analytics.
Yeah, exactly. And the maturity of the level of analytics for each tool varies. When you're making a decision on two things, like making a decision on someone interacted with your website and they signed up for a free trial and set up one thing. Like, without a data team, what are you using to get the awareness of, well, you have a data team, but if you didn't, like, what would be a good starting point for making decisions off of this combined data?
Well, I'd say there's two elements to that. The first is to Molly's earlier point about the data literacy components. I think it's important in this first element to understand what are the data capabilities of the platforms you're residing in. So, if you're in an ecosystem with Marketing Cloud and Salesforce, there's a capability to look in from the outside. So if you want to be able to do more and see more, there's a skill set you might want to self-develop on related to SQL, related to being able to extract data and then be able to use it elsewhere. So think about the systems you have and really try to understand the accessibility of more information. Because to your point, Aaron, if you log in, you're in the lens of the product itself and the limitations of what that lens allows. So find out if there's capabilities or ways that you can get around the product itself to see the data that the product lives and breathes on top of. So that's one element. But honestly, the other element that I would encourage everybody to do is talk more about data, talk more about the significance of data on operations, talk about the discipline of data and the benefits of having a repository like a Snowflake or Redshift or something where data resides, and move your organization with you on the journey of understanding data as a component. I think that that's the evolution. And when I think about this community that has been spun up, I love the challenge of people talking more about data and the respect and understanding of what happens with data. That data is a living resource that's accessible and available across multiple parts of the business. And its quality has a direct impact on the effectiveness of various phases of the customer journey. So
I love that. I mean, just understanding the story, like when it comes to, I'm sure you all work with leadership, and we ran a report where, you know, we found that the trust in data was very different between the people who were responsible for the data versus the executives who are consuming the data. And that gap in trust is just this, not, you know, leadership not being aware of, like, what did it take to get to this, you know, this data point. Like, I think any data professional or ops professional loves the idea of, you know, exposing all the effort that went into getting to this point.
right.
And what you're talking about is, you know, really conveying that effort and that understanding of how we got there to a wider audience within an organization, which will like level up both education and trust in that data.
Yep.
Well, we're at time, so I think this concludes our session, and I want to thank you, Paul and Molly. This has been a fantastic chat. It's been a pleasure speaking with you guys for the first time here on RevGenius. So with that, I will end this session.
Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Thanks so much.
Good to chat, Molly. Thanks,
Take
Aaron.
care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.